Hello, welcome to Fishbowl. We are Group 1. I'm Kelly. We have Jim with us today, and Idris and Amy. Our Fishbowl is going to be with this textbook that we've covered over the summer with our summer reading on the beach. And our first question for today is, why do I hold back from participating? So I thought I'd get us started with a quote that I found on page 56. It reads, "Participation is both personal and social. It is a complex process that combines doing, talking, thinking, feeling, and belonging. It involves our whole person, including our bodies, minds, emotions, and social interactions." The reason why I picked this quote is because I think my personality has a tendency to be the doer and the thinker and the talker. And so sometimes I hold back from participating if it involves a lot of kind of feeling and belonging. That kind of starts to make me feel, I don't know, icky. I just want to get things done, and that wastes time is my thinking. So sometimes I hold back from participating for that reason.
Yeah, Kelly, that's a great point. I'll go ahead and take the next one. And I took it really a different approach with that one, and I was really intrigued about the idea of really power, either feeling powerless to change or feeling like even though you have the power, the idea that your actions really won't take hold any meaningful change. So the word that really was the word for me was cynicism in this. So when I asked when and why do I hold back from participating, I thought about the times I'm most cynical of the situation that I'm in. And page 208 had a quotation on this from Wenger. It says, "Power is really complex. Negotiability without identification is empty. It's meaningless power, freedom as isolation, and cynicism." So I think of the groups that I have withdrawn the most from are groups that either we're a powerful group, but we're taking on a wicked problem, and I don't think that our effort is really going to make much of a dent, or we just don't have a lot of authority within our group, and I fear that the next level above us might just squash it, and our effort won't go very far with that. So and then also, another key word in that is really identity as well. As I just took over a new position in my workplace, and I'm still establishing my identity in a new role. And I feel like having really a concrete sense of my own identity in a group says a lot if I really choose to participate the most as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck kind of by this theme that seemed to kind of pop up over and over in the book about so like on pages 167 and 168, the author discusses ways in which our identities are shaped by our participation and our non-participation. But I thought that that's got to run the other direction as well, right? Like where we choose to participate and where we choose to not participate is also partly informed by our identities. Like Kelly just said, like I want to do, I don't necessarily want to feel. Like that's part of her identity, and so it affects where she's choosing to participate and where she's not. For me, it has a lot to do with competency. I think of like some of the people and or committees on campus that I kind of have either stepped away from or just haven't joined it as well, because I'll be frustrated. Like I'll be frustrated with lack of doing or lack of thinking or lack of anything that I feel like is productive. So that's kind of where I came down on that.
Yeah, and Amy and Jim, I definitely agree with both of you. Where Amy, you said you're the reason for you not participating is maybe a lack of knowledge of within a group, and then Jim, you stated you want to be firm in your identity, and so I definitely agree with that. And on page 167 and 168, Wenger states that participation depends on what the individual cares about and wants to know, and what connection the individual seeks. So Jim, in your landscape, you want to be able to find your identity in your new position, and have your connection to what you seek and what you want to initially be a part of. So I definitely agree with your statement there.
Well, I think in participation, there's a real vulnerability there too, because when we engage in a process, we're putting out our ideas and our thoughts and our emotions for full display, and that really opens ourselves up to judgments. And people, oftentimes are fearful of being judged, and so it is easier sometimes to do something in isolation because it's a safer place to be in isolation and just go do it ourselves.
Right.
So on page, let's see, 76, there's a quote that says, mutual engagement involves not only our competence, okay, but also the competence of others. Belonging to a community where people help each other, it is more important to give and receive help than to try to know anything yourself. So it's interesting, Jim, like you said, it's that vulnerability, and I think sometimes some of the hard part is to, receive that help or even to be able to ask that help. Is difficult, but there's this sense of mutuality, I think, that has to happen in a group and be in a participation. And I think sometimes that's really hard because we're a society of individualism and we like to be able to do things ourselves or not burden other people, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. On page 152, kind of straddling just off of that, where the author's talking about it's more important to give and receive help than to make sure that you know everything oneself. But that results in a definition of individuality that differs from, say, forms of individuality in certain academic forms, in which knowledge is a form of personal power, going back to the PowerPoint someone made earlier, and not knowing is largely constructed as a personal deficit. And I can certainly see in Research One institutions where this who holds the knowledge is also like a power player as well. In my situation where it's not as much research, I thought that the power struggle doesn't have to necessarily be over the obvious thing like knowledge, but it could also be about trust. Is it like my office mate, I trust her explicitly, because we've been in situations time and time again where she's proved herself. And so I am anytime I need to participate on anything with her, I'm right there. But I've had other coworkers burn me. And so I'm a lot less likely to jump in and participate on something with them because of past experience. So I think trust is definitely, and which goes to vulnerability and all of the things that Jim was saying, trust is a factor as well.
Mm-hmm. And that, Amy, on page 171, it says, participation provides protection from one's sensitivity. And that's what you were kind of speaking on, where, you kind of want protection from, being burned. And, your protection is you find protection in your colleague that you most confide in.
Absolutely.
So when I was reading this book over the summer, I had one of those big, huge aha moments that had a lot to do with who I am as a person, an educator, a leader. And it's from page 109 in the book. It says, certain individuals seem to thrive on being brokers. They love to create connections and engage in import-export, and so would rather stay at the boundaries of many practices than move to the core of any one practice. So I'm like, aha, that's me. And I was like, well, there's a label for it, so that means I can stay being a broker? Because I'm like, is that okay? Is it good to be a broker? And I could give multiple examples of me being that way, where I have all these networks of people I know, and I love connecting people. I just, one of my leadership challenge was to send out an email being a little bit more explicit and detailed, and the next thing you know what I'm doing, I'm connecting to people and I'm getting the heck out of Dodge. And I was now, is that a bad thing? When I started reading about, your participation and who you are and your role in participation in the group, I started thinking, it takes all kinds, right? So it's good to be that person. Maybe the idea is just to recognize that, or is the idea that you be more participatory and you allow yourself to be vulnerable? So what's the goal there? Do you guys have thoughts?
Real quick, I absolutely do, because I noticed that quote that you had posted in the Google group, and I started laughing because I pulled out different practices can make competing demands that are difficult to combine into an experience and correspond to a single identity. The work of reconciliation may be the most significant challenge faced by learners who move from one community of practice to another. And that's me. I am not the broker. Like, I don't want my one foot in one world and one foot in another. So, so to answer your question, I think it takes all kinds. Yeah. I think both are good, and they're both necessary.
Yeah. And I believe, just to piggyback off of both of Kelly and Amy's point, our identities are shaped by combinations of participation and non-participation. Like Kelly said, when you make that connection and then you pull away, that's kind of shaping your identity as well.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that Wenger chooses words very carefully, and one word that gets used really throughout the book is that word alignment. The idea that we have to have our community to be aligned if we're going to be able to have this coordination and have this feedback. And going back to what Amy said about sometimes our whole organization, our whole community is not always aligned in a sense that's going to allow us to be fruitful and productive. Where I have those same kind of things where I pick and choose who I interact with and who I participate with, and I'm out of alignment, but I feel like to some degree that's going to help us to get more action done.
Yeah. And I think, when you read a book called Community of Practice, the automatic assumption is that, like, that's the gold standard, like being a community of practice, right? And she goes to a lot of lengths to point out that a community of practice isn't always necessarily, it's always not necessarily like a positive thing. Yeah, I can't pull up. There's a quote that is in my paper here somewhere that I don't remember, but it's essentially like reminding you that individual doesn't necessarily automatically mean bad, and community doesn't automatically necessarily mean good. But to be aware of the dynamic of the interaction between the two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe like distinguishing between a community of practice and like a task-oriented team of some kind, like they talked about, like that. So exactly, and I think that helps when you are thinking differentiating the two, because then you know what's expected or what's needed within that group of people to make it successful. Acknowledging that, yeah. So are we ready to move on to the second question?
I think so.
Okay, so our second question is, why do I commit to solving problems by myself? Does anyone want to take that on?
Yeah, so I think when you don't feel a connection to a group, you commit to solving, those problems by yourself. On page 168, there was a scenario, a vignette of the two women that were claims processors who didn't feel connected to. There were two older women who didn't feel connected to the younger processors, and so they were, kind of isolated by themselves. So they didn't feel that connection to the group, and so they were solving their problems, by themselves. So I think connection is a major part of why people work by themselves or isolate themselves.
Absolutely. No, I think just when I first heard this question, it just made me jump right back to what Jim said initially in the beginning part of our conversation. Is a lot to do with that idea of competence. I have to be honest. I commit to solving things myself because I get it done quicker. It's going to be complicated by bringing in too many people, and it's just got to get done. So I think that's a challenge, and again, that personality of me being that broker is part of it as well.
Yeah.
I think when I went back and really thought about, when are the times that I just commit to solving problems by myself, and I'm just going to do this in isolation. And I kept coming back to that idea of power, and Wenger gets right into that right away on page 15, which is really right on the front of this book. The question of power is a central one in social theory, and so much of how we interact within a group or withdraw from a group can come back to that concept of power. And I really think back to really connecting this to my problem with practice. And my problem with practice deals with student retention or student attrition. Does a student stay or does a student go? And when I really think about that power dynamic in that, if a student decides to stay at a university, to some degree, maybe because they feel that they have some of their own self-determination at a university, they may feel like they have some power in some kind of group to control the outcomes that are coming their way. But on the flip side of that, a student may choose to leave university because they feel powerless, either by the environment, either on that campus or outside, but they don't feel in control of their own actions. When I go into isolation to solve problems, usually a lot of times it's because I'm trying to gain power. Well, if I figure it out, if I figure out the thing that nobody else did, well, maybe that's going to look good for me. I'll get a little more power within the organization. Or I just feel powerless and I feel like I just have to go do it by myself.
Yeah, really good point. I liked kind of thinking about the way that these two questions relate to each other, like non-participation versus taking on something by yourself, because they're certainly related to one another. But essentially, I think the heart of it is that when you choose to work independently in isolation, it's essentially a form of non-participation, right? It's not non-activity. Like, you're definitely still, as many of us have chosen to do problems by ourselves. You're doing stuff, you're being busy, but you're simply just not participating in a community of practice. And I don't know, maybe I'm harping on this too much, but I also want to go back to, like, maybe sometimes that's not always necessarily a bad thing. If the community of practice would be something that would not be productive, maybe working independently isn't necessarily painted bad, and the community is painted good always. It's contextual.
Mm-hmm.
We've got about 3 minutes until 20 minutes.
Oh, wow. Got through this quickly. Does anybody have a remaining quote that they listed that they want to share, maybe with either one of the questions, that we don't want to leave that out?
I'd like to throw out really quick on page 220. She says, access to information without negotiability serves only to intensify the alienating effects of non-participation. And I saw a direct application to my context through like new adjuncts, where they're coming in and we're throwing all of this information at them, and they're part of the community, but they didn't have anything to do with like negotiating what those materials are, the creation, and it can be alienating. And then just this morning I was thinking about it, and this could describe some of our students' feelings as well, which kind of goes back to Dewey's point that we just read about an external versus an internal authority. If they're trying to participate, but they feel like something external outside themselves is like pushing everything on them, it can feel isolating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the page number handy, but there was a point that stuck with me in the book about how if we're working by ourselves, we're working in isolation to solve a problem. Isolation doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't working to consider other people. Sometimes they make the point that you might be working on a PowerPoint, and even though your students aren't in the room looking over your shoulder, you're still considering them as you're putting this together. So to some degree, just because you're in the room by yourself doesn't mean you're solving the problem by yourself, because you're working toward your audience. I think the times I'm most productive is when I'm thinking about my audience. The times I'm probably the most out of alignment is when I'm not considering them. I'm not letting them help to set my agenda. I'm really just doing what maybe I'm the only one who might think it's the best solution.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like we got a lot of lessons to be learned as we navigate the next couple of years together. Practice. This is helpful to know a little bit about each other, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think this concludes. I think we've done a great job. We're amazing.
Agreed.
I think so.
Makes me wish I was in face-to-face classes with you folks.
I know, and all these time zones. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop recording. All right, I think we're there.
All right.